What if you vanished from one of the busiest airports in Canada, captured on camera one moment, gone the next? In early 2007, that's exactly what happened to Emma Louise Carroway, a 28-year-old financial analyst who walked through Toronto Pearson International Airport and simply disappeared. For 17 years, investigators hit dead end after dead end, the case growing colder with each passing season. But then, in 2024, a dedicated cold case team applied cutting-edge technology to decades-old surveillance footage, uncovering 18 minutes of movements that would finally crack the case wide open, leading to an arrest that shocked the entire community. This is the story of how a cold case, seemingly impossible to solve, became one of the most remarkable solved cases in Canadian history. Let me take you back to that winter night in 2007 and introduce you to the woman at the center of this mystery. Emma Louise Carroway, 28 years old. If you had met her, you'd remember her. Friends and colleagues described her as meticulous, organized, someone who planned everything down to the minute. She worked as a financial services analyst for a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Toronto, a job that required precision, attention to detail, and frequent travel. Emma was good at what she did, very good. She'd graduated from the University of Toronto with honors, worked her way up through the ranks, and by 2007, she was handling major client accounts, traveling between Toronto, Montreal, and occasionally New York for high-stakes meetings. But Emma wasn't just about spreadsheets and quarterly reports. She was deeply devoted to her family. Her father had passed away from cancer when she was 23, leaving her mother, Margaret, and her younger brother, Daniel, who was 25 at the time. Emma had stepped into a protective role after her father's death, calling her mother every single day, helping Daniel navigate his own career in graphic design, organizing family dinners on Sundays at her mother's house in the Beaches neighborhood. Emma loved routine. She had her favorite coffee shop on Queen Street East, where the barista knew her order by heart. Medium dark roast, no sugar, splash of cream. She went to the same yoga studio every Tuesday and Thursday evening. She was a frequent flyer, racking up air miles like most people rack up grocery receipts, and she knew Pearson Airport like the back of her hand. Terminal 1, Terminal 3, security checkpoints, airline lounges. She could navigate that airport blindfolded. On weekends, when she wasn't traveling, Emma volunteered at a women's shelter downtown, helping newcomers to Canada understand financial literacy, setting up bank accounts, explaining credit scores. She believed in giving back, in using her skills to help others build stable lives. Her friends remember her laugh, this bright, genuine sound that could light up a room. They remember how she'd always be the one to organize birthday celebrations, send thoughtful gifts, remember the small details about your life that most people forget. Emma Carroway was the kind of person who made the world a little bit better just by being in it. And then, on a cold winter evening in early February 2007, she disappeared without a trace. Let me walk you through what we know happened that night. Emma had been in Montreal for 3 days, meetings with a major client, one of those grueling business trips packed with presentations and negotiations. On February 7, 2007, she wrapped up her final meeting around 3 in the afternoon. She sent an email to her boss confirming that the client had signed the contract, then headed to Montreal Trudeau Airport for her flight back to Toronto. The flight was uneventful. Air Canada, scheduled to land at Pearson around 7:30 in the evening. Emma had packed light, just her carry-on rolling suitcase and her leather laptop bag, the one her brother had given her for Christmas. She was wearing her typical travel outfit. Black pants, comfortable flats, a charcoal gray blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. The plane touched down at Pearson Terminal 1 at 7:34 p.m., right on schedule. Emma deplaned with the other passengers, walking up the jet bridge into the terminal. She pulled out her phone, powered it on, and within minutes, she sent a text message to her brother Daniel. The message read, "Just landed. Heading to baggage claim. Home in an hour. Love you." Daniel would later tell investigators that this was completely normal. Emma always checked in, always let them know where she was, when to expect her home. It was part of her meticulous nature, part of how she showed love. Keeping people informed, never making them worry. Security cameras captured Emma walking through the terminal that evening. The timestamp shows 7:41 p.m. She's moving at a steady pace, her rolling suitcase trailing behind her, phone in her other hand. She passes a Tim Hortons, walks past gate B67, continues down the main concourse. Other passengers flow around her, some rushing, some moving slowly, the typical airport chaos. At 7:43 p.m., Emma reaches a junction in the concourse. To the left is the main route toward baggage claim and ground transportation. Straight ahead continues toward more gates. And to the right is a narrower corridor, one that leads to ground crew access points, some restrooms, a few service elevators, areas not typically used by passengers but not restricted either. The camera shows Emma pause for just a moment. Then she turns right down that side corridor. And after that moment, Emma Louise Carroway was never seen alive again. She never collected any checked baggage because she hadn't checked any. She never walked out to the parking garage where her Toyota Camry sat in short-term parking, her space paid through the week. She never called her mother. She never arrived home to her apartment on Kingston Road, where her cat, Milo, waited by the door. Emma simply vanished into the maze of Toronto Pearson International Airport, one of the busiest airports in North America, surrounded by thousands of people, hundreds of cameras, and somehow, impossibly, she was gone. The first alarm sounded when Emma didn't come home that night. Daniel Carroway waited at his apartment that Wednesday evening, expecting his sister to stop by like she often did after Montreal trips. She'd usually swing past his place in Leslieville, just a few blocks from her own apartment, drop off some pastries from her favorite Montreal bakery, catch up for 20 minutes, then head home to Milo. By 9 p.m., Daniel sent a text. "Where are you?" "Pastries." No response. By 9:30, he called. The phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. Emma's voice, bright and professional. "Hi, you've reached Emma Carroway. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." Daniel left a message. Just checking in. Let me know you got home okay." By 10 p.m., Daniel called their mother, Margaret. "Mom, have you heard from Emma? She was supposed to land over 2 hours ago." Margaret hadn't heard from her daughter since that morning. A brief call before Emma's last Montreal meeting. The worry in Daniel's voice immediately transferred to Margaret. They both knew Emma. She didn't go silent. She didn't forget to check in. This wasn't like her at all. By 10:30 p.m., Daniel called Toronto police. The dispatcher took down the information. 28-year-old woman, supposed to arrive home from the airport, no contact for 3 hours, no response to calls or texts. The dispatcher explained that technically, Emma hadn't been missing for 24 hours, the standard waiting period for an adult missing person report. But something in Daniel's voice, the absolute certainty that something was wrong, prompted the dispatcher to send an officer to do a wellness check. By 11 p.m., police knocked on Emma's apartment door. No answer. The superintendent let them in with a spare key. Inside, everything was neat, organized, exactly as Emma had left it 3 days earlier. Milo, her orange tabby cat, meowed desperately for food and attention. The bed was made. Dishes were clean in the drying rack. Her mail sat in a tidy pile on the kitchen counter. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing suggested foul play at the apartment. But Emma wasn't there. Police checked with the airline. Emma had been on the passenger manifest. She'd boarded in Montreal. The flight had landed. But there was no record of her in any hospital emergency room. No reports of accidents on the roads between the airport and her home. No indication of where she'd gone. By midnight, Toronto police elevated the case. This wasn't a woman who'd gone out with friends and forgot to call home. This was a meticulously organized person who'd sent a text saying she'd be home in an hour, then vanished. By 1 a.m. on February 8, 2007, detectives were pulling surveillance footage from Toronto Pearson Airport. Detective Sergeant Michael Chin took the lead on the case that first night. A 15-year veteran of Toronto police, Chun had worked missing persons, homicide, and major crimes. He'd seen cases where people disappeared intentionally, cases where foul play was obvious from the start, and cases that simply defied explanation. Emma Carroway's disappearance from the very first hours fell into that last category. Chun and his team started with the surveillance footage. Pearson Airport in 2007 had extensive camera coverage, but it wasn't what we have today. The resolution was lower, the cameras were analog, and there were blind spots, areas where coverage simply didn't exist. Service corridors, employee-only zones, certain stairwells and back hallways, these areas had minimal or no camera surveillance. The footage showed exactly what I described earlier. Emma walking through the terminal, turning down that side corridor at 7:43 p.m. Chen's team traced her movements backward from that point, confirming she deplaned normally, walked through the terminal alone, didn't appear to be meeting anyone or being followed. But after she turned down that corridor, the footage became problematic. There was one camera at the entrance to the corridor, the one that captured Emma turning right. The next camera, positioned about 50 meters down, didn't capture her walking past. It was as if she'd evaporated in the space between those two cameras. Chen's team searched that corridor inch by inch. It led to several locations: 2 single-occupancy restrooms, an elevator that went down to ground crew areas, a locked door to a maintenance space, and at the far end, an emergency exit that would trigger an alarm if opened. The restrooms were empty. The emergency exit alarm hadn't been triggered that night. The maintenance space was locked, and the only people with access were specific airport employees and contractors. The elevator required badge access to call it, and it only went down to restricted ground crew areas, places where passenger access was prohibited. Airport security checked their access logs. No unauthorized badge swipes in that corridor during the time Emma disappeared. No alarms triggered. No emergency calls from that area. It was as if Emma had simply dissolved into thin air. Detective Chun expanded the investigation. They pulled Emma's phone records, her banking information, her credit card activity. The last cell phone ping from her device came from a tower near the airport at 7:45 p.m., just 2 minutes after the last camera footage. Then nothing. Her phone went dark, either powered off or destroyed. No credit card activity after February 7th. No bank withdrawals. No activity on her social media accounts, which Emma used regularly to stay connected with friends and share travel photos. Her apartment showed no signs that she'd planned to disappear. Her passport was in her desk drawer. Her savings account was untouched. Her cat was there, unfed and distressed. Chun interviewed Emma's family, friends, and colleagues. Everyone gave the same portrait. Reliable, scheduled, loving, no signs of depression or distress, no financial problems, no romantic entanglements that had gone wrong, no enemies, no one who'd want to harm her. Emma's life was stable, successful, normal. Her ex-boyfriend from 2 years prior was tracked down and interviewed. He'd moved to Vancouver, had a new relationship, and had an airtight alibi for February 7th. He was at a work conference in Calgary, surrounded by witnesses. He was clearly devastated by the news and cooperated fully with police. Investigators interviewed every employee who'd worked at Pearson that night, every airline staff member, every security guard, every person who might have crossed paths with Emma. Hundreds of interviews, thousands of hours of work, and nothing, absolutely nothing, pointed to what had happened to her. They searched the airport parking garage. Emma's Toyota Camry sat exactly where she'd left it 4 days earlier, collecting parking fees. Inside the car, nothing unusual. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Her registration and insurance papers were in the glove compartment. An air freshener hung from the rearview mirror. In the back seat, an umbrella and a reusable shopping bag from Loblaws. Searchers expanded their efforts beyond the airport. They searched wooded areas nearby, drainage ditches, construction sites, anywhere a body might be concealed. They dragged ponds and checked waterways. Cadaver dogs were brought in, alerting to nothing. The media picked up the story quickly. Woman vanishes from Pearson Airport became headline news. Emma's photo appeared on television, in newspapers, on early social media platforms. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, each one requiring follow-up. Alleged sightings came from across Ontario, from Montreal, from as far away as British Columbia. Every tip was investigated. Every lead was chased down. And every single one turned into a dead end. By the summer of 2007, 6 months after Emma's disappearance, the investigation had consumed thousands of police hours and generated a file that filled multiple boxes. But there were no suspects, no clear motive, no body, and no answers. Detective Chun, who'd worked the case with the dedication of someone who takes every victim personally, found himself staring at that surveillance footage over and over. 18 minutes. That's how long Emma was visible on various cameras from the moment she deplaned until she turned down that corridor. 18 minutes of normal, documented movement, followed by absolute absence. Chun knew, deep in his investigator's gut, that something had happened in that corridor or immediately after Emma entered it. But with no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no body, the case was going nowhere. By early 2008, Emma Carroway's disappearance officially became a cold case. For Margaret Carroway and Daniel, the years after Emma's disappearance were a special kind of torture. It's one thing to lose someone to death, to illness, to a tragic accident. There's grief in that, deep and painful grief, but there's also closure, finality, the ability to mourn and eventually, slowly begin to heal. But when someone vanishes, when there's no body, no conclusion, no answers, the grief never settles. It stays sharp, active, a wound that can't close because you never know if today might be the day she walks through the door, or if today might be the day you learn she's been gone forever. Margaret kept Emma's childhood bedroom exactly as it had been. The walls still held posters from Emma's university years. Her bookshelf still held her favorite novels. On the dresser, framed photos, Emma and her father at her high school graduation, Emma and Daniel at the CN Tower, Emma and her mother on a trip to Prince Edward Island. Every February 7th, the anniversary of Emma's disappearance, Margaret and Daniel held a vigil. They'd gather with friends, former colleagues, and members of the community at a park near the beaches, holding candles, sharing memories, keeping Emma's story alive. Local media would cover it in the early years, but as time went on, as newer cases captured public attention, the coverage dwindled. Daniel threw himself into advocacy work. He joined support groups for families of missing persons, learned about the gaps in Canada's missing person protocols, pushed for legislative changes. He created a website dedicated to Emma's case, updating it regularly with any new information, any small development, maintaining hope when hope seemed impossible. In 2009, a woman in Winnipeg called police saying she'd seen someone who looked exactly like Emma working at a coffee shop. Daniel flew to Winnipeg immediately. The woman at the coffee shop looked similar, but it wasn't Emma. It was never Emma. In 2011, human remains were found in a wooded area north of Toronto. For 3 agonizing days, Margaret and Daniel waited for DNA results. The remains belonged to someone else, another family's tragedy, but not theirs. The not knowing continued. In 2013, a psychic contacted the family claiming to have visions about Emma's location. Out of desperation, Margaret met with this person who described specific places, specific details. Police followed up on the information. Nothing came of it. Just another dead end. Another cruel false hope. Through the 2010s, Toronto police maintained Emma's file in their cold case section. Every few years, a detective would review it, looking for something previous investigators might have missed. The surveillance footage was examined and re-examined. Witness statements were reviewed. Tips that had come in years earlier were revisited. But the technology of 2007 had limits. The surveillance cameras had captured what they'd captured, and there was no way to enhance the grainy footage to see more detail. The access logs showed what they showed, and without more sophisticated data analysis tools, there was no way to cross-reference movement patterns across thousands of employee badge swipes. The case remained frozen, stuck in that terrible limbo of unsolved mysteries. Detective Michael Chun retired from Toronto Police in 2016. Before he left, he met with Margaret and Daniel one last time, sitting in the same coffee shop where Emma used to get her daily dark roast. Chun told them he'd never forgotten Emma, that he'd done everything he could, that he wished he had answers to give them. Margaret held his hand and thanked him for never giving up during those crucial first years. But after Chun left, Margaret turned to Daniel and said something that still haunts him. "I don't think I'll ever know what happened to my daughter." She was wrong. But it would take another 8 years and a revolution in technology to prove it. In 2023, Toronto Police Service launched a renewed cold case initiative, dedicating resources and specialized personnel to unsolved cases from the 2000s and early 2010s. The initiative was built on a simple premise. Technology had advanced dramatically since many of these cases were investigated, and evidence that yielded nothing 15 or 20 years ago might tell a completely different story today. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Brennan headed the new cold case unit. At 42 years old, Brennan had built a reputation for solving seemingly impossible cases through meticulous analysis and creative application of new technologies. She'd used genealogical DNA databases to identify previously unknown suspects, applied new forensic techniques to old evidence, and utilized advanced data analytics to find patterns invisible to earlier investigators. When Brennan's team began reviewing cases from 2007, Emma Carroway's disappearance immediately caught their attention. An intelligent, stable woman vanishing from a major airport, last seen on surveillance footage entering a corridor and never emerging, it was the kind of case that haunted detectives. Brennan read through the entire case file, watched all the original footage, and noted the same frustrations that Detective Chun had documented 17 years earlier. But Brennan had tools that Chun never had access to. By late 2023, artificial intelligence-based video enhancement had advanced to extraordinary levels. Software could take low-resolution analog footage and use machine learning algorithms trained on millions of images to reconstruct missing details, clarify grainy sections, and even track movements in ways impossible with the naked eye. Brennan's team sent all of Emma's surveillance footage to a specialized forensic lab that focused on video analysis. The lab used cutting-edge AI enhancement software to reprocess every second of footage from February 7, 2007, not just the clips showing Emma, but all footage from the terminal, the corridor, adjacent areas, and ground crew zones from 6 p.m. to midnight. While that processing was happening, Brennan assigned another detective, Constable James Okafor, to dig into the airport's access data. In 2007, investigators had checked badge swipe logs for the specific corridor where Emma was last seen. But they hadn't had the capability to cross-reference that data with vehicle movement logs, shift schedules, and security camera timestamps across the entire airport complex. Okafor, who had a background in data science before joining the police, built a comprehensive database. He imported badge swipe records from February 7th, every single access event by every single employee and contractor. He imported vehicle gate logs from parking areas and service roads. He imported shift schedules from the airport authority, identifying everyone who'd been on duty that evening. Then he used modern analytics software to create a movement timeline for every person who'd been at Pearson Airport during the crucial hours. This kind of analysis would have taken months, maybe years, using 2007 technology and manual review. With 2023 tools, Okafor completed it in 3 weeks. And in late January 2024, the breakthrough came. The AI-enhanced footage revealed something extraordinary. Remember that corridor where Emma was last seen? The original 2007 footage showed her entering at 7:43 p.m., but she never appeared on the next camera 50 meters down. Investigators at the time assumed she'd entered one of the restrooms or accessed the elevator somehow, but with no badge swipe recorded and no way to enhance the grainy footage, they couldn't be certain. The AI enhancement changed everything. When the forensic lab processed the footage using modern algorithms, the software was able to clarify details that had been invisible in the original. The enhanced footage showed Emma walking into the corridor, her rolling suitcase behind her. About 15 meters in, she slowed down, appeared to look at her phone. Then the footage showed something investigators had never been able to see before. A figure emerging from a doorway. The doorway was recessed, set back about a meter from the main corridor wall. In the original 2007 footage, it appeared as just a dark shadow, a patch of poorly lit space. But the AI enhancement revealed it was a door, and it was opening. A man stepped out. He was wearing what appeared to be a ground crew uniform. Dark pants, a reflective vest, a baseball cap. He was carrying something in his hands, maybe a clipboard or a radio. On the enhanced footage, you can see him approach Emma. He appears to say something to her. Emma stops, turns toward him. They exchange words. The conversation lasts perhaps 20, maybe 30 seconds. Then Emma follows him back toward that recessed doorway, and they both disappear from view. That doorway led to a ground crew access point, a space that connected to service elevators, stairwells, and maintenance corridors running beneath the terminal. It required badge access to enter. In 2007, investigators had checked the badge log for that specific door during the time Emma disappeared. The log showed no swipes for that door between 7:30 and 8 p.m. But here's what Okafor's data analysis revealed. The badge reader for that particular door had malfunctioned multiple times in early 2007. Airport maintenance records, which hadn't been reviewed during the original investigation, documented at least 3 incidents in January and February where the door's electronic lock had failed to record swipes, even though employees had accessed the door with valid badges. The door was supposed to be locked when not in use, only accessible with proper credentials. But if the badge reader was malfunctioning, someone with a badge could open the door without leaving a digital record. And that's exactly what had happened. Okafor's database analysis identified a specific employee whose movements aligned perfectly with Emma's disappearance. His badge swipes that evening told a story. 6:55 p.m. Badge swipe entering the ground crew facility on the lower level. 7:15 p.m. Badge swipe accessing a vehicle gate on the perimeter road. 7:38 p.m. Badge swipe at a service entrance to Terminal 1, close to the corridor where Emma was last seen. Then nothing. No badge swipes for the next 45 minutes. 8:23 p.m. Badge swipe at the same perimeter vehicle gate he'd used earlier. 8:41 p.m. Badge swipe leaving the ground crew facility. The vehicle logs showed something even more revealing. This employee had checked out a ground services van at 7:12 p.m. The van had driven out through the perimeter gate at 7:15 p.m. The same van returned through the gate at 8:23 p.m. Where had that van been for 68 minutes? The employee's name was Raymond Pritchard. 46 years old in 2007, he'd worked at Pearson Airport since 2002 as a ground services technician, handling baggage loading, aircraft servicing, and various support tasks. He'd been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, along with hundreds of other employees, but nothing had raised suspicion. His shifts were normal, his supervisor had no complaints, and he had no criminal record. But now, 17 years later, his movement pattern on February 7, 2007, looked extremely suspicious. Brennan's team pulled Pritchard's employment file. He'd worked at Pearson until 2010, then transferred to a cargo facility in Hamilton, Ontario. He'd retired in 2019 and currently lived in Stony Creek, a city just outside Hamilton. Detectives researched Pritchard's background more thoroughly. They discovered something that should have raised red flags in 2007 but somehow hadn't. In 1997, Pritchard had been accused of assault by a former girlfriend in British Columbia. The charges were dropped when the girlfriend declined to testify. In 2001, while working at Vancouver International Airport, Pritchard had been investigated internally after a female co-worker reported that he'd made unwanted advances and followed her to her car after a shift. He'd received a written warning but wasn't terminated. When he applied for the Toronto position in 2002, these incidents weren't discovered during the background check, either because records weren't shared between provinces or because the internal investigation at Vancouver Airport never made it into any official database. Pritchard had a history, a troubling history. And on February 7, 2007, his movements placed him in the exact location where Emma Carroway was last seen, during the exact time window when she vanished. But movements and history aren't proof. Brennan needed evidence, physical evidence. And to get that, she needed a search warrant. In March 2024, Brennan presented her findings to a judge. The enhanced surveillance footage, the badge swipe analysis, the vehicle logs, Pritchard's history. The judge agreed there was sufficient probable cause. On March 18, 2024, search warrants were executed at 3 locations. Pritchard's current residence in Stony Creek, a storage unit he rented in Hamilton, and the property of a family member where Pritchard kept several old vehicles, including, incredibly, the same ground services van he'd driven on February 7, 2007. Airport vehicles are supposed to be decommissioned and destroyed after years of service. This one had somehow ended up in private hands, sitting behind Pritchard's brother's garage, half covered with a tarp, waiting. When forensic teams entered that storage unit in Hamilton, They found a space packed with items accumulated over decades. Old furniture, boxes of documents, sports equipment, tools, holiday decorations. But tucked in the back corner, inside a locked filing cabinet, investigators found a brown leather laptop bag. The bag was old, the leather dried and cracked. Inside was a laptop computer, the kind that was common in the mid-2000s, a Dell model with a cracked screen. And on the bag, embossed in gold letters near the zipper, ELC. Emma Louise Carroway. Daniel had given his sister that laptop bag for Christmas 2006. He'd had her initials embossed on it at a specialty leather shop in Kensington Market. He'd chosen the brown leather because Emma had mentioned she liked the classic, professional look. It was one of the last gifts he'd given her before she disappeared. And now, 17 years later, it was sitting in Raymond Pritchard's storage unit. Forensic analysis of the laptop bag revealed biological material, hair fibers consistent with Emma's DNA profile, which police had on file from items recovered from her apartment in 2007. There were also fingerprints on the laptop itself, partial prints, but enough for a match. Emma's prints, exactly where you'd expect them if she'd been using the laptop regularly. But the discoveries didn't stop there. The ground services van, that old vehicle sitting behind a garage in Stony Creek, became a goldmine of evidence. Forensic specialists spent days examining every inch of that van. In 2007, the vehicle had likely been cleaned multiple times as part of regular airport maintenance protocols. But forensic science in 2024 could detect evidence that would have been invisible 17 years earlier. Using luminol testing, investigators found traces of blood in the rear cargo area of the van. The amount was small, microscopic, really, residue that had survived despite cleaning attempts. DNA analysis matched the blood to Emma Carroway. Fiber analysis revealed something equally damning. Emma's rolling suitcase, recovered from the evidence locker where it had been stored since 2007, had been tested back then but yielded no useful results with the technology available. Now, using advanced microscopic analysis, forensic scientists found trace materials on the suitcase handle and wheels. Automotive grease, road salt, and synthetic fibers consistent with industrial carpet. The interior of the ground services van had carpet, and samples from the vehicle matched the fibers found on Emma's suitcase. The grease and salt matched materials used at Pearson Airport for vehicle maintenance and de-icing operations in winter 2007. More evidence emerged from Pritchard's residence. In his basement, investigators found a locked footlocker. Inside were items that made the forensic team's blood run cold. Jewelry that belonged to Emma, confirmed by Margaret Carroway through photographs. A wristwatch Emma had worn regularly, a silver bracelet her father had given her for her 21st birthday, a pair of earrings Daniel recognized from photos taken during Emma's Montreal trip. Pritchard had kept trophies. It's a pattern seen in certain violent offenders, a psychological need to maintain tangible connections to their crimes. These items, combined with the laptop bag, the biological evidence in the van, and the fiber analysis, built a comprehensive forensic picture. But the most damning piece of evidence came from Pritchard himself, or rather, from something he'd written. Hidden in the same footlocker with Emma's jewelry was a spiral notebook, the kind you'd buy at any dollar store. Inside, in handwriting later confirmed to be Pritchard's, were pages of rambling notes, dates, descriptions, scattered thoughts spanning from 2003 to 2009. Most of the notes were mundane work schedules, shopping lists, notes about hockey games. But scattered throughout were darker passages, descriptions of women he'd seen at the airport, notes about their appearance, their routines, where they'd walked, what they'd worn. And on a page dated February 2007, a single entry, finally, Terminal 1, problem solved. Never should have talked to me like that. The entry was vague, carefully vague, not a confession by any stretch. But combined with all the other evidence, it painted a picture of a man who'd been watching, waiting, and who'd acted on February 7, 2007. Forensic psychologists who later reviewed the notebook noted patterns consistent with stalking behavior, obsessive fixation, and violent ideation. Pritchard had been documenting his fantasies, and at some point those fantasies had become reality. The evidence was overwhelming. Physical evidence, forensic evidence, documentary evidence, all pointing to one conclusion. Raymond Pritchard had abducted Emma Louise Carroway from Toronto Pearson Airport on February 7, 2007, and he had killed her. But there was one agonizing gap in the evidence: Emma's remains. Despite extensive searches of properties connected to Pritchard, despite ground-penetrating radar surveys and cadaver dogs and excavations of possible burial sites, Emma's body was never found. Pritchard had 17 years to conceal that evidence, and wherever he'd hidden her, the secret remained buried. But the law doesn't require a body to prosecute murder. In cases where the totality of evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt that a homicide occurred, charges can be filed. And on April 22, 2024, they were. Raymond Pritchard was arrested at his home in Stony Creek on a Tuesday morning. Detectives from Toronto Police Service, supported by Hamilton Police, executed the arrest warrant at 6 a.m. Pritchard was in his kitchen, drinking coffee, when officers knocked on his door. According to the arrest report, Pritchard opened the door, saw the police, and his first words were, "I knew someone would come eventually. Not what's this about? Or is there a problem?" Or any of the normal responses of an innocent person confronted by police at their door. His immediate response suggested awareness, a guilty conscience that had been waiting for 17 years. Pritchard was taken into custody without incident. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful confinement in connection with the disappearance and death of Emma Louise Carroway. First-degree murder in Canada is the most serious charge, reserved for planned and deliberate killings, carrying a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The arrest made national headlines. Pearson Airport cold case solved after 17 years appeared on every major news outlet. CBC, CTV, Global News, all covered the story extensively. The shocking detail that the suspect had been an airport employee, someone who'd been interviewed during the original investigation, someone who'd continued working at the airport for 3 more years after Emma's disappearance, sent waves of anger and disbelief through the community. For Margaret and Daniel Carroway, the news came in a phone call from Detective Brennan. Margaret later described that moment in an interview with CBC. "I couldn't breathe. For 17 years, I'd waited for this call, and now that it came, I couldn't breathe. Daniel was with me, and we just held each other and cried. Finally, we knew. Finally, there was someone to blame, someone to be held accountable." But mixed with the relief was a devastating realization. Emma was never coming home. The slim hope, the irrational but persistent hope that maybe she'd lost her memory. Maybe she was living somewhere unaware of who she was. Maybe somehow, impossibly, she'd walk through the door one day. That hope was gone. The arrest confirmed what they'd feared but never wanted to accept. Emma had died that night in February 2007. The community reaction was intense. Vigils were held across Toronto. Emma's case had become a symbol over the years, representing all the unsolved disappearances, all the families still waiting for answers. The fact that this cold case was finally solved gave hope to others, but it also brought rage that Pritchard had been free for 17 years while Emma's family suffered. Online communities dedicated to true crime and cold cases erupted with discussions. How had Pritchard been missed during the original investigation? Why hadn't his background check revealed his prior incidents? How had he managed to keep Emma's belongings for nearly 2 decades without anyone discovering them? These questions demanded answers, and they would get them, but first Raymond Pritchard had to face trial. The trial of Raymond Pritchard began in January 2025 at the Ontario Superior Court of Justice in Toronto. Justice Helena Morrison presided over the case. The Crown prosecutor was Sandra Chen, a 20-year veteran known for her meticulous preparation in complex cases. Pritchard was represented by a court-appointed defense attorney, James Bannerman, who faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client against overwhelming evidence. The trial was open to the public, and every day, the courtroom was packed. Margaret and Daniel Carroway sat in the front row, Margaret clutching a framed photo of Emma, the same photo that had appeared on missing person posters for 17 years. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. Over 3 weeks, they presented the evidence piece by piece, building a narrative of predation, opportunity, and murder. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Brennan testified first, walking the jury through the entire investigation. She explained how the cold case unit had reopened Emma's file, how AI-enhanced surveillance footage had revealed the crucial moment when Pritchard approached Emma in the corridor, how data analysis had tracked his movements that night. The jury watched the enhanced footage on large screens. You could see Emma walking through the terminal, checking her phone, turning down that corridor. Then you could see Pritchard emerging from the doorway, approaching her, engaging her in conversation. Even without audio, the body language told a story. Pritchard appearing official, perhaps telling Emma there was a problem with her flight or security issue. Emma following him, trusting that an airport employee in uniform was there to help. It was the last time Emma Louise Carroway was seen alive. Constable James Okafor testified about the badge swipe and vehicle log analysis, presenting charts and timelines that showed Pritchard's movements aligned perfectly with Emma's disappearance. The prosecution argued that Pritchard had lured Emma through that doorway, taken her down to the ground crew areas, forced her into the van, and driven out of the airport through the perimeter gate. Where did he take her? The prosecution believed he drove to a secondary location, somewhere he'd prepared in advance, somewhere secluded. Emma was killed there and her body was concealed. Then Pritchard returned to the airport, clocked out, and went home, beginning 17 years of living with his secret. Forensic experts testified about the evidence found in the van. Emma's blood, the fiber matches, the trace materials. They explained how modern forensic techniques could detect evidence that 2007 technology would have missed, how the passage of time actually worked in their favor in some ways because Pritchard had kept the van, never expecting that science would advance to the point where microscopic traces could be recovered. The jewelry, the laptop bag, the notebook, each piece was presented to the jury with devastating effect. Margaret Carroway testified, describing her daughter, the life Emma had lived, the dreams she'd had, the emptiness left by her absence. Margaret's voice broke multiple times, but she pushed through, determined to tell the jury who Emma was, to make her real, to ensure the jury understood they weren't just deciding the fate of evidence and timelines, but delivering justice for a vibrant young woman whose life was stolen. Daniel testified about the last text message Emma sent him, about the 17 years of not knowing, about the toll it took on their family. He looked directly at Pritchard during his testimony and said, "You took my sister, but you also took my mother's peace, and you took 17 years of our lives. Nothing you suffer will ever be enough." Pritchard sat emotionless through most of the trial, occasionally whispering to his attorney, showing no visible reaction to the evidence or the family's testimony. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that possession of Emma's belongings didn't prove murder, that the notebook entry was vague and could refer to anything. Bannerman suggested alternative theories. Maybe Pritchard found Emma's belongings abandoned. Maybe someone else killed her and Pritchard was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe the forensic evidence was contaminated. But none of it held up under the weight of the prosecution's case. In closing arguments, Sandra Chun addressed the jury for 90 minutes, walking through every piece of evidence, every timeline, every forensic finding. She argued that the evidence formed a complete picture, that there was no reasonable explanation for Pritchard's possession of Emma's belongings, for his movements that night, for the blood in his van, other than the obvious. He abducted and murdered Emma Louise Carroway. Raymond Pritchard had opportunity, Chun told the jury. He had access to the airport, knowledge of blind spots, a vehicle, and time. He had means, a secluded area, a van, and the authority of an official uniform that made Emma trust him. And the evidence shows he acted on that opportunity and used those means to take Emma's life. The defense wants you to believe in coincidences and contamination, but the truth is simpler and darker. This man is a killer, and he's had 17 years of freedom that he stole from Emma Carroway. The defense's closing argument was brief, urging the jury to find reasonable doubt, to question the forensic science, to remember that the burden of proof was on the prosecution. But reasonable doubt requires a reasonable alternative explanation, and the defense couldn't provide one. The jury deliberated for 7 hours over 2 days. On February 14, 2025, 18 years and 1 week after Emma Carroway disappeared, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood and read the decision. On the count of first-degree murder, guilty. On the count of kidnapping, guilty. On the count of unlawful confinement, guilty. Margaret Carroway collapsed into Daniel's arms, sobbing. Other family members and supporters wept openly. Raymond Pritchard showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as if the verdict was about someone else. Justice Morrison scheduled sentencing for 1 month later, March 14, 2025. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecution presented victim impact statements. Margaret spoke about the 17 years of agony, the anniversaries, the false hopes, the grief that never healed. She spoke about Emma's dreams, the career she would have built, the family she might have had, all stolen by one man's violence. Daniel read a statement on behalf of Emma's friends and former colleagues, describing the hole her absence left in their lives, the questions that had haunted them, the relief of finally knowing the truth mixed with the horror of understanding what Emma endured in her final moments. The prosecution requested the maximum sentence: life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Given Pritchard's age, 64 at the time of sentencing, this would effectively be a life sentence. The defense asked for leniency, arguing that Pritchard had no prior violent convictions, that he'd lived a law-abiding life for 17 years after Emma's death, that he deserved some consideration. Justice Morrison was unimpressed. In her sentencing decision, Justice Morrison described the crime as calculated, predatory, and heinous. She noted that Pritchard had used his position of trust as an airport employee to lure Emma into a vulnerable situation, that he'd planned the abduction carefully enough to avoid detection for 17 years, and that his keeping of Emma's belongings as trophies demonstrated a callous disregard for her humanity. "Mr. Pritchard," Justice Morrison said, addressing him directly, "you stole Emma Carroway's life, her future, and her family's peace for 17 years. You have shown no remorse, no accountability, and no indication that you deserve mercy. The law requires that I impose a sentence that reflects the gravity of your crimes and denounces this conduct in the strongest possible terms. The sentence: life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Additionally, Pritchard was designated a dangerous offender, meaning even if he becomes eligible for parole in 2050, at age 89, he would be subject to intense scrutiny and restrictions. As he was led out of the courtroom, Pritchard turned and looked back at Margaret and Daniel one time. Margaret later said that look contained nothing, no apology, no recognition, just emptiness. And then he was gone, led away to begin a sentence that would almost certainly last the rest of his life. The resolution of Emma Carroway's case sent ripples through multiple systems and communities. It became a catalyst for change, a case study in how technology can breathe new life into cold cases, and a painful reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist even in secure, monitored spaces. Toronto Police Service used the case to justify expanded funding for their cold case unit. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Brennan became a leading voice in advocating for the application of AI and advanced data analytics to unsolved cases. She's since traveled across Canada speaking at law enforcement conferences, teaching other departments how to utilize modern tools to revisit investigations that stalled in the pre-digital era. The Greater Toronto Airports Authority implemented sweeping changes to their security protocols. All surveillance footage is now stored indefinitely and backed up to cloud servers, ensuring that evidence isn't lost if physical media degrades. Camera coverage was expanded to eliminate blind spots, particularly in service corridors and employee-only areas. Badge reader systems were upgraded with redundant verification, and any malfunction now triggers immediate maintenance response. Background checks for airport employees became more comprehensive, with cross-provincial information sharing and mandatory reviews of internal workplace complaints. The gaps that allowed Raymond Pritchard to be hired in Toronto despite his history in British Columbia have been closed, though many argue those reforms came far too late for Emma. Emma's case also influenced Canadian legislation around missing persons. The Emma Carroway Act, proposed in 2026, would create a national missing persons database with enhanced information sharing between jurisdictions, mandatory notification protocols for airports and transportation hubs, and dedicated funding for cold case investigations using advanced technology. As of this recording, the bill is still working through Parliament, but it has strong support from advocacy groups and families of missing persons. For the true crime community, Emma's case became a powerful example of solved cases, a reminder that cold cases can be cracked decades later, that families shouldn't lose hope, and that advances in science and technology are changing the landscape of justice. Margaret Carroway passed away in September 2026, 18 months after Pritchard's conviction. She'd lived to see justice for her daughter, to know the truth, to watch the man responsible be held accountable. But friends said the 17 years of not knowing had taken a toll that justice couldn't heal. She died at age 72, and at her funeral, Daniel read a letter his mother had written to Emma, words she'd penned after the verdict, words of love and loss, and finally, after so long, goodbye. Daniel continues advocacy work through the Emma Louise Carroway Foundation, which he established in 2025. The foundation provides support to families of missing persons, funds cold case investigations, and lobbies for legislative reforms. He speaks regularly about Emma's case, ensuring her story remains visible, a testament to the importance of never giving up on the missing. The case appears regularly in discussions of cold cases solved, featured in documentaries, podcasts, and criminology courses. It's studied as an example of how investigative persistence combined with technological advancement can overcome seemingly impossible odds. But beyond the systemic changes and the legal precedents, Emma Carroway's case is ultimately a story about a young woman who had her entire future stolen in 18 minutes. It's about a family that endured 17 years of agonizing uncertainty. It's about a predator who hid in plain sight, protected by gaps in systems and the limits of 2007 technology. And it's about the dedicated investigators who refused to let Emma be forgotten, who reopened a cold case when others might have left it closed, who applied new tools to old evidence, and who finally delivered answers that a family desperately needed. The question of where Emma's remains are located remains unanswered. Pritchard has never disclosed that information, taking that final piece of the truth with him to prison. Search efforts continue periodically, based on new tips or analysis of places Pritchard had access to in 2007. Daniel has publicly stated that he hopes one day to bring his sister home, to lay her to rest beside their parents, to give Emma the funeral she deserved. Until then, Emma Louise Carroway is remembered not as a victim who vanished without explanation, but as a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a professional whose life mattered, whose absence was felt, and whose case became a turning point in how we investigate disappearances and pursue justice. Her story is a reminder that every cold case represents a real person, a real family, and real hope that someday, somehow, the truth will emerge. The arrest of Raymond Pritchard shocked the community, but perhaps it shouldn't have. In retrospect, the evidence was there in 2007, scattered across surveillance cameras, badge swipes, and vehicle logs. The challenge was that the tools to connect that evidence, to see the pattern, to reconstruct 18 minutes of movements from thousands of hours of footage and millions of data points, those tools simply didn't exist yet. This reality raises profound questions about justice and technology. How many other cold cases from the 1990s and 2000s could be solved if we applied modern forensic and analytical tools? How many families are still waiting for answers that might be hidden in old evidence, waiting for someone to look with new eyes and new methods? The Emma Carroway case proves that time doesn't have to be an ally of criminals. Yes, Pritchard had 17 years of freedom he didn't deserve. But those 17 years also brought advances in technology that ultimately ensured his conviction. The van he kept became evidence against him. The items he hoarded as trophies became his downfall. The surveillance footage he thought was too grainy to reveal his actions was enhanced beyond what he could have imagined. For families of missing persons, Emma's case offers both hope and heartbreak. Hope that cases seemingly impossible to solve can break open with new approaches. Heartbreak that justice delayed is still a form of justice denied, that the years of suffering cannot be returned, that knowing the truth doesn't erase the pain of what was lost. Detective Sarah Brennan has said in interviews that the Carroway case changed how she views every piece of evidence. We can't know what technology will exist in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, she's explained. So we preserve everything, document everything, because today's dead end might be tomorrow's breakthrough. That philosophy now guides cold case investigations across Canada and internationally. Evidence that might have been discarded in previous decades is now carefully stored and cataloged. Surveillance footage is archived indefinitely. DNA samples that couldn't be processed in the past are maintained for future analysis. The lesson of Emma Carroway is that we should never assume a case is unsolvable, only that we haven't found the right tool yet. For Raymond Pritchard, whatever motivated him to abduct and kill Emma Carroway remains partially unknown. He has never spoken publicly about the crime. He declined to testify at his trial. He offered no explanation, no apology, no justification. Psychologists who analyzed his notebook entries and history suggest he may have been a serial predator, that Emma might not have been his only victim, that other unsolved cases might have connections to him. Investigators have examined cold cases from airports where Pritchard worked, looking for patterns, for similar disappearances, for other families who might finally get answers. So far, no definitive connections have been established, but the search continues. The possibility that there might be other victims, other families still in the dark, adds another layer of tragedy to this case. It's a reminder that predators can hide in positions of authority, in uniforms that inspire trust, in places we assume are safe because they're public and monitored. Emma Carroway trusted Raymond Pritchard because he was an airport employee, because he approached her in an official capacity, because nothing in his demeanor suggested danger. That trust cost her everything. This case reminds us of several crucial truths about cold cases and the pursuit of justice. First, persistence matters. Detective Michael Chun worked Emma's case for years in the 2000s, documenting everything, following every lead, even when the case went cold. That foundation made it possible for Detective Sarah Brennan to pick up the investigation in 2023. Without Chen's meticulous original work, the cold case team would have had nothing to build on. Second, technology is transforming justice. AI-enhanced video analysis, advanced data analytics, forensic techniques that can detect microscopic traces of evidence. These tools are solving cases that were impossible to solve just a decade ago. Every cold case deserves to be reviewed with modern methods, because the evidence that means nothing today might tell a complete story tomorrow. Third, families of missing persons deserve answers. Margaret and Daniel Carroway waited 17 years, never giving up, never letting Emma be forgotten. Their advocacy, their refusal to accept silence, kept pressure on authorities to keep Emma's case active. Not every family has the resources or energy to maintain that fight for decades, which is why systematic cold case reviews are so important. Fourth, no case is ever truly cold. As long as evidence exists, as long as witnesses are alive, as long as investigators are willing to look with fresh eyes, there is hope for resolution. The term cold case is almost a misnomer now, because with modern tools, those cases can be reheated, re-examined, and solved. And finally, every unsolved disappearance is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's loved one. Emma Carroway wasn't just a statistic, wasn't just another missing person poster. She was a real person with dreams and plans and people who loved her. Solving her case mattered not just for the sake of justice in the abstract, but for the real, tangible peace it brought to her family, for the closure that came from knowing the truth, however painful that truth was. If you're listening to this and you have information about any unsolved case, any disappearance, any crime that has gone unreported or unsolved, please come forward. Your information, no matter how small it seems, could be the piece that breaks a case open. It could be the detail that brings someone home or puts a predator behind bars. Cold cases are solved when people care enough to keep looking, when investigators refuse to give up, when technology advances give us new tools, and when witnesses find the courage to speak. Emma Carroway's case is proof that justice, though delayed, can still be achieved. The arrest shock that went through the community when Raymond Pritchard was charged wasn't just surprise. It was a collective recognition that someone had been living among us for 17 years, hiding a terrible secret, protected only by the limits of yesterday's technology. That shock should motivate us to support cold case investigations, to fund forensic advances, to push for the kinds of systemic changes that Emma's case has inspired. Because somewhere, right now, there's another family waiting for answers. Another case sitting in a box. Evidence that seems to lead nowhere. Questions that seem impossible to answer. And maybe, with the right tools, the right investigators, and the right moment, that case will be the next one solved, the next arrest that shocks a community, the next family that finally gets closure. Emma Louise Carroway's story is tragic, but it's also hopeful. It proves that time doesn't erase truth, that dedication can overcome obstacles, and that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. With that said, thanks for listening. Remember Emma. Remember all the missing. And remember that cold cases can be solved, that arrests can still shock communities even decades later, and that the pursuit of justice has no expiration date. Until next time.